I'm sitting here doing one of my favourite things, which is knitting. And there are a number of things that I like about knitting. First of all, I love how tactile it is. I love the way that good quality yarn feels when it works with good quality bamboo or wooden needles to create a fabric that I then use to create a garment that I then gift to somebody else most of the time. Most of my knitting is done for other people because I get tremendous satisfaction from that as well. And those of us who knit have a term for people whom we gift our knitted goods, and they're called knitworthies. So if you have received something that has been knitted specially for you, you need to understand that it is a very special gift, that the person who has made it for you or for your child has done so with tremendous love and affection, and that every stitch has been created with you or your loved one in mind. And it's a rather a bigger deal than running into Dunnes Stores and picking up something and saying, there you are, I thought of you. Not to diminish gifts that are bought in shops, we all do that as well, but there is something particularly special and loving about making a gift by hand for somebody else. The other thing I love about knitting is how the repetitiveness is meditative. Um, uh, there's something very calming about the repetition of the different steps. You know, the in, around, through, and off to create a step, to create a stitch. That just makes it really soothing and calming for the soul. I remember years ago, maybe 15 or more years ago, sitting beside somebody who was driving, and I was knitting as she drove, and she said, you know, when you knit, she said, your breathing slows down, everything about you just slows down. And I thought, yeah, it's a kind of meditation, because of course we all meditate in different ways, but that's a discussion for another video post, I suppose. And I knit all the time. Like, I always have something on the needles. And funny as it might sound, I find that when I am knitting, it can help to concentrate me on, to help me focus on whatever else it is I'm doing, if that makes sense. Like, if I'm reading something and knitting at the same time, I find that the words are more easily absorbed by me. The message of what I'm reading goes in better or quicker when my hands are occupied doing something like knitting. And I'd also knit when I'm watching Netflix or Prime or whatever it is I'm watching, because I feel, and I know this isn't the best example of self-care and taking time out, but I feel like I shouldn't be sitting doing nothing. So at least if I'm knitting, I'm doing something productive. And that helps me to feel less guilty about watching Wentworth or whatever it is I'm currently binging on Prime or Netflix. But the reason I'm talking about knitting and narcissism is because my mother taught me to knit when I was 4. And I'm really glad she did, because I have enjoyed it since I was 4. Now, there have been times when I've been very frustrated by a pattern or very frustrated by my own inability to do something like weave in the ends properly, or, you know, those sort of technical things. But for the most part, knitting does nothing but bring me joy. However, being a narcissist, my mother did her best to take the joy out of it. And this is what I want to do today is to illustrate the subtle ways in which our narcissistic mothers undermine us. Because it's almost like death by 1,000 cuts or Chinese water torture, you know, the drop by drop by drop that eats away, that erodes your self-esteem rather than bashes it out of being in one fell swoop. Because it's these kind of subtle things that are difficult to put your finger on and difficult to explain to other people, and difficult to explain to yourself. That kind of, it's not quite gaslighting, but it is undermining you. So the story is, today's story, boys and girls, is about my mother teaching me to knit when I was 4, and teaching me to knit the way I do it now with those of you who are more expert knitters than I will see that I don't wrap the yarn around my fingers the way you're supposed to. because I was never taught how. And I remember being a teenager, and my mother was watching me knit, and she got annoyed with how I was doing it, because she said, you'll never be any good until you learn to wrap the yarn. And I thought, well, I was never taught to wrap the yarn. So she didn't offer to teach me how. She didn't say, well, I taught you to do it that way when you were 4 because it was easier, but now you're a lot more than 4. Let me show you how. I think it would make things better for you. I think it would be better if you knew how to do it this way. She didn't do that. She just told me that I would never be any good at knitting because I couldn't do it the way she did it. She told me that my tension would always be rubbish, that I'd never produce anything that anybody could wear because it would just be rubbish, because the tension wouldn't be correct, because I wasn't doing it properly, because I wasn't threading the yarn around my fingers. Now, of course that hurt me, and of course it upset me. But as a child, as a teenager, it never occurred to me to say, well, would you ever show me how then? Because the response to that would have been that she didn't have time. And to be honest, I'm well into my 40s now, and it really hasn't bothered me enough that I've looked up on YouTube how I should be wrapping the yarn. But at the time it did bother me, because she was my mother and I believed her. I believed that I would never be any good at this because I couldn't master the wrapping the yarn thing. And that, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, is absolute bullshit. There is nothing wrong with the way I knit. I've produced hundreds of garments for people who have been thoroughly pleased and delighted to have them and to wear them. This is a commissioned piece for one of my daughters who's very excited about having a new top to wear when the summer comes, as I look out at the rain in almost May. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with my knitting, but for years I believed that there was, and that it would never be any good, because that's what my mother told me, because it was her way of undermining something that I did and something that I enjoyed. And I think that was part of her problem with my knitting. Wasn't how good or how bad it was the fact that it was something that I enjoyed. So she had to undermine that. And the way to do it was to tell me that I was never going to be any good at it, and to tell me why I was never going to be any good at it, and refuse to provide a solution. And if this sounds familiar to you, and you're wondering why something that was said to you when you were younger bothered you more than perhaps it should have — should is my least favorite word in the English language, just so you know. That's why the heavy air quotes. Maybe that's why. Maybe you were being undermined and gaslit by your narcissistic mother because she couldn't bear the thought that you actually might be not just as good, but gosh, maybe even better than she was at something. And she couldn't bear the thought of that. And also, maybe it was that your mother, like mine, loved to take the good out of everything that I did, loved to burst my joy bubble. And she did that for over 30 years until I broke free of her. And she can't do that anymore.